Hi guys, welcome to Learning Rabbit. I hope you have made such faces when people ask you about Docker networking, but don't worry, after the end of this lecture, you would know the stuff about Docker networking. You'll be able to configure two containers or more than that within the same networks. So let's talk about the agenda for today. So first we'll start off by discussing the different types of network drivers that Docker provides you. We'll also discuss when to use each one of them. We'll connect the Docker networks we'll connect the Docker containers with the networks. We'll connect the REST backend that we made in the last lecture. If you have not seen that video, I would suggest that you go and watch that video and then come back here. The link would be in the top right section somewhere. So the last part is we'll connect the REST backend that we created in the last lecture with the MySQL database. But this time, we will not hard-code the IP address. We'll use the Docker service discovery instead, and we will use just the container's name and not the IP address. So in that case, if the container comes up with a different IP address or crashes and restarts itself, but this time comes up with a different IP address, we will still be secure because we are using the host name and not the IP address. IP address may change, but the host name will remain the same. And Docker will find out the IP address by just using the host name. This is called service discovery in Docker. So we'll use that instead of hard coding stuff. So here are the different types of network that Docker has. So one is the user-defined bridge networks. They are actually the best when you want to communicate multiple containers. Like we have a MySQL database and we have the REST backend, both running in different containers. So we'll see how we can create a bridge network for that, and that's how the containers can communicate with each other, and we will not need to hard code the IP address. They can find each other using just the name. Then we have the host networks. So when you use the host networks, in that case your host machine's IP address is used. So any port that your Docker container exposes is directly exposed on your host. So you do not need to do the port forwarding. We'll see that in the differences between the bridge and the host in the next slide. Don't worry about that. And then we have the overlay networks. So sometimes you want that you have your laptop and you have your friend's laptop. Both are running two different containers on them, and you want these Docker containers to communicate with each other. In that case, you create the overlay networks. We will not be demonstrating that because that is out of the scope for this, but you can read about that on the Docker's website. So a bird's eye view of an overlay network is that whenever you want two Docker machines which are residing on two different hosts, you want them to communicate with each other, you usually create an overlay network. Similar is the Mac VLAN networks, but in this case, you can also spoof or mimic as if your Docker container also has a MAC address. For that, we create the Mac VLAN networks. And they're usually, people who are coming from the VirtualBox or VMware environment, they usually require such stuff so that they can mimic the Docker containers like a physical machine, because a physical machine has a MAC address as well. So these were some definitions, but in this lecture, I'm just going to discuss about the bridge networks and the host networks. So let me create the network first. So I'm going to create a bridge network, which is actually by default. So the command is docker network create, and I'm going to create #net. This is the network that I'm going to use in all my containers in the REST as well as in the MySQL, so that they can connect to each other using the bridge network. And that's it. When you do docker network ls, you see that the #net is created. Now we are just going to use that in our containers when we run them. Now let me create the MySQL image again, and we're again going to use the same network for this as well. Network, it was #net. Now that the database is running, let's go back to our backend Since the database is up and is using the hashtag net bridge network, now let's run our REST backend and use the hashtag net in that as well. So I have used minus minus network hashtag net so that my backend and my database, they both are on the same network. So now when I run this, I also need to remove the host name from here, and instead of that I'm going to use the container name of my MySQL container. If you go up, you should see that I gave a name to my container using the minus minus name. I've already explained this, that minus minus name is to provide the container name instead of just a plain hash. So the name was MySQL underscore DB. So I'm using that here. So now I'm using just the host name. So Docker Service Discovery will take this host name and automatically resolves this into the IP address. And so our backend will be able to connect to the MySQL database. So now you see that when you see this output, it means that the backend was able to communicate with the database. We can verify that by logging into the container. So let's log in inside my MySQL, which is docker exec minus ti. The container was MySQL underscore DB, and we want to get inside the bash shell. We are inside, then we log in. Root was the user, minus p was root, that is the password. So we are inside. Let's see if we have the Twitter database or not. We have it. So that means the backend was able to create the database. And let's see if we have the Twitter table inside it or not. So I'll do show tables. Yes. So the table name was tweets that we created using the class name. My bad, I think I said Twitter before, but tweets was the table that we created. So that is how you use the bridge network. Now let me show you an example of a host network. What is the benefit of the host network? Now, in order to use the host network, you can just remove this and give the host type network here. So I'm using host here. So that means it is going to use the host network, which we already have by default when the Docker is installed. You can just verify that using Docker ls. So I'm providing this now. Earlier we used this, which was of type bridge. Now we're going to use host because it is of type host, and I'm going to show you host networking. And when we're using host, everything will be available to you, but there will not be any IP address for your container because you'll be sharing the network with your host. That means the machine that is running Docker, which is my laptop here, so the IP address of my laptop becomes the IP address of the container as well. So the IP address of my container, my laptop, is 192.168.1.13. So no more IP address will be assigned to the container when we now inspect after running this. The IP address will not be provided for my container. Just like it was assigned for the bridge network, this time there will be no IP address because now our IP address matches the IP address of the host. Actually, there is some coding problem because since the MySQL is not up, my container will not come up. So let me also start the MySQL database. for that, I'm going to do docker run on the MySQL, which is this. So now that the MySQL database is running, now with the host networking, now the MySQL is running, but with the host networking. Let's also start the backend this time with the host networking. So this is my backend container. I'm going to run that, but now with the network host. So this is host driver. So when I start this, you see that now it is unable. You see that you get this error, unknown MySQL server host, because the host only they cannot detect by the host name. They need an explicit IP address. So for that, again, we have to find out the IP address. For that, I'm going to do docker ps, that is the container ID. So I'm going to say inspect this, and now we have to find out the IP address, but we don't have any because our container was started with a host driver and that does not have any IP address. So what should we do? So for that, we have to use the IP address of your host, and that we can find out with the ifconfig command, or the Windows user can use ipconfig. So this is my host IP address, and now when I use this, you see now I'm able to connect, because when you're using the host network driver, you are sharing the IP address space with your laptop, with your host. So whatever IP address that your host has, the same IP address can be used for your container. They can be good if you want to just bootstrap your application using Docker, if you're just trying something out. But the preferred way is to have a bridge network. And if you are on a different machine, then you can have overlay networks or you can have Mac VLAN networks. But host networks are quite limited. The service discovery is not available. So you'll have to find the IP address, put it here, and then you can use it. So that was the major difference between the host only and the bridge networks. So now let's jump back to the slide and see what's coming ahead. So we saw that the host networking, since it is sharing the same IP address as your host, you don't need to do the explicit port forwarding because that is anyways happening. And I forgot to show that. Let me get back to my terminal again. So as I'm using the network host, and when I run this without any port forwarding, I'm just going to remove the port forwarding from here. When I run this like this, since I have not done the port forwarding, how will I be able to access this port from outside? But the question is, since we are using the host network, that means we are actually in the same IP address space. We don't need to do any port forwarding. Any port that has been exposed on the Docker has been directly exposed on our host. So I can just go in my terminal, try it out with a curl request, and I'm just using the localhost 3306, and I did not do any port forwarding. If you go up and you see this command, I did not do any port forwarding, yet I will be able to access this port. You see this? There was some binary output from the MySQL, so, or you can just try the telnet command. So I'm doing a telnet localhost on port 3306. So I'm able to connect to this database without any port forwarding because this container's port were directly exposed on the host. So no port forwarding was required. You see, I have entered the MySQL's console. You see this version number being printed. This is just Telnet console. There are different ways to fire commands in Telnet, but you were able to connect to it. So that shows that you did not need to do any port forwarding and you were just able to connect to it. So that is how the host networks work. They share the same IP address space, so you don't need to do any explicit port forwarding. So we saw that the bridge network was used by default when we ran a container. But host networking or the host network driver, it was not used by default. So bridge networking, we saw that when we used it by default, the service discovery by container name was not available. Instead, we had to hard code the IP address. Host networking, since it shares the network of your host, it ignores the port forwarding. Even if you have it, it does not matter. It will ignore it. So any port opened on this network is directly accessible. You don't need to do any port forwarding for that. Host networking, we saw that it does not get its own IP because the IP address will be shared from the host. From the bridge network, when you create your own, or even if you don't, you still get an IP address. These were some of the differences between the bridged and the host networking driver. So now our containers were something like this. But when we create a bridged network, they were actually joined like this. So this connection was created using the bridged or the host. If we use the bridged, we could just use the name of the containers and we could access them from each other. But if you use the host, we had to use the IP address of the host. In my case, the host was an Ubuntu system. So whatever IP address my system had, I had to use that in my backend to access the database. So these are some of the commands that I used for network management. First, you can create a network using docker network create. You can delete it using rm. You can list using ls. And you can attach to a container using docker run --net. But you can also disconnect from a network using docker network disconnect. The driver can be host, can be bridge, can be any custom name that you gave to your network while creating it. And then you can give your container name. So it will disconnect this driver from the container. And you cannot disconnect from a host network driver if it's in use. You'll get an error like container cannot be disconnected from host network or connected to host network dynamically, like this. Right? But you can do that for other networks by the same command. So these were some of the problems that I discussed at the beginning of this lecture. These were the problems that came up when we were building our own Docker application. So the first problem was the IP address was hard-coded. We've already solved this problem using Docker Service Registry, Docker Service Discovery, by using the Docker networks. That was covered in this lecture. And in the upcoming lectures, I'm going to talk about solutions to these two problems, which is regarding passwords and automation around Docker. So this was it for this video. I hope you learned about how to create Docker networks and how can you use them to let two containers or more containers talk to each other. In the upcoming lectures, I'll be talking about Docker Compose, which is an excellent way of bootstrapping Docker application. It brings a lot of automation around it. And we'll also talk about Docker secrets, with the help of which we can remove the use of hard coding the passwords in the environment files. So stay tuned, watch all the videos that I'm going to post, and keep learning. Stay at home and do share this video with your friends. Do comment, share and like this video, and I'll see you in the next video. Till then, it's bye bye from Learning Rabbit.